I Want to Believe. Chapter 11. Hombrecitos. A small team from the Italian section greeted the exiles at the airport. Recognizing the security failures of the Latin American sections from furious circulars, they had spent the previous night arranging to safely escort their leader without police tails, in a plan to subvert the asylum provision that they live at a registered address and retire from politics. From the airport, they would drive to a church where Candida Previtera, Alberto Di Franco, and Omero Cristalli would enter through the front, as though thanking God for their safe arrival. Then Sierra, Rovira, and J. Posadas would exit through the back, where another car would be waiting to take them to a secure location to safely re-establish the International Secretariat underground. After some exhausted fumbling, they gave up. The transformational portal was locked, and the trio exited back through the front of the church. Also unable to find a safe house at such short notice, they were forced to proceed to the apartment of Piero Leone, the public face of the party whose address was listed in their newspaper. Posadas knew the European Bureau was far less experienced than the BLA, and he considered it an asset. 4 months prior, the International had been on the brink of collapse after the crisis of H&M exposed the gap between his authoritative infallibility and his theoretical incapacity. Such conflicts were far less likely around the obedient young Europeans. For many of them, the lectures of Posadas were their introduction to socialism and militancy, with selections from the rest of the Marxist canon coming later in their education. High-level questions were left largely to the South American leadership as they dutifully fulfilled their tasks of publishing and recruiting. Believing the serendipitous raid on Shangri-La had moved the International, and history itself, to a higher stage, he was emboldened to demand even more. Italy had always been one of the main sites of communist struggle. At the end of the First World War, workers seized nearly every factory in the industrial north. The Italian Communist Party, PCI, led by Antonio Gramsci, split from the Socialist Party, PSI, in 1921 to urge the workers to seize state power. Aided by the monarchy and the PSI, Benito Mussolini's fascists were installed into power in a move meant to defend democratic stability. Mussolini instead took total control over the state and brutally suppressed the left, outlawing the PCI entirely. As his regime collapsed at the end of the Second World War, tens of thousands of armed partisans once again flew the red flag, and in 1944 the PCI was re-established. There was a sense they could have a revolution then and there, but Stalin, having promised to cede Western Europe and fearing a proxy civil war such as in Greece, ordered the partisans to disarm and the PCI to pursue a modest democratic strategy. But by 1968, communist youth were fed up with parliamentarism. They began to read Marx as a philosopher of international revolution instead of steady social progress, and looked to Mao and Guevara as their revolutionary idols instead of Gramsci and Stalin. It could have been a golden opportunity for the largest Trotskyist group in the country, Livio Matan's Gruppi Comunisti Rivoluzionari, GCR, had they not continued the Pabloist strategy of indefinite entryism into the PCI since 1951. The cordial working relationship between Maidan and the PCI leadership led many young militants to perceive the two as functionally the same. As new Maoist, autonomist, and ultra-left groups sprung up independently of PCI, the GCR was pushed into crisis. Former militant Lidio Cirillo recalled, beginning of long quote, "In 1967, things moved far more quickly than our capacity to understand them and take action. Some Catholic groups had begun to move leftwards with what we saw as incredible speed. At the university, everything was happening. Occupations and pitched battles with fascists. The, quote, Che Guevara circle, which we had built with 1 foot inside and 1 foot out of the PCI, began to fill with young people we didn't know, who spoke of the party in ways even we thought too disrespectful." End quote. As desertions increased, Maidan was forced to remove what little was left of his GCR from the PCI in 1969, just as a potential replacement settled in. the idiosyncratic PCI deputy Pietro Ingrao had played a major role in Poseidis' asylum case, a maneuver perhaps reflecting his sympathies with far-left movements, or his desire to keep Trotskyism domesticated within the PCI. Either way, Poseidis leapt at the opportunity. Within the PCI, the largest communist party in the West that had earned 2 million members at its height, the International could, quote, advance more than before, Poseidis said at the first meeting after his arrival. From there, they could expand their influence in the socialist parties, the anti-imperialist colonial struggles, and among national populist strongmen, to build a new revolutionary constellation called, quote, the Communist International of Masses. The title meant nothing to anyone outside Poseidis' circle, but he often referred and appealed to it as though it already existed. More visions of the near future came to him in the manic days after his arrival, perhaps too many. Quote, now more than ever, he continued at the meeting, my dynamism has increased. I see something, and I'm trying to translate it into images. Rapid. I'm still thinking like this. I give you images, complete images, in panels, and when you see them, the, quote, little men come out. In a moment of crisis, they work rapidly, with control, and without a motor. They work. End quote. Poseidis occasionally referred to these hombrecitos in other speeches. They were most likely a metaphor for the division of labor in his mental factory, demonstrating how his mind worked to overcome obstacles in moments of confusion or doubt, and how his militants should work as well. Leone's memoir of his time in the RCPT, Circolo Vizioso, Vicious Circle, is a vivid illustration of what it meant to be one of Poseidis' little men. The night of their arrival, after sleepless days of desperation and paranoia, he nearly died after falling asleep on his motorcycle while running a simple errand. He woke up in the hospital, miraculously uninjured, to a, quote, Poseidicized life. Along with his obligations to his wife Mario and their newborn son Luigi, named for what they called Poseidis in casual conversation. He retained his prior political responsibilities to the party, while becoming Poseidis' host and fixer. Tensions of a normal roommate were exacerbated by being forced to watch his infallible leader's cruel coldness towards his wife and feuds with his secretary. In one instance, DiFranco confided in Leone that he spied Poseidis sneaking a chunk of collectively purchased Parmesan cheese from the refrigerator in the middle of the night, a grave crime of individualism for anyone else. Academic work became his only respite from the endless tasks and drama. In the rare moments he wasn't working for Poseidis or studying, he found himself incapable of talking to outsiders. Quote, one day, like so many others, I heard a merchant talk about his issues. At that moment, I had the clear feeling that he was in the world, while we were more or less on another planet, or on a spaceship. We were something like Martians. End quote. Increasingly focused on his superiors, Poseidis made Leone his middleman to the PCI. It was a strange reversal for Leone, who had for years savaged the PCI in the party newspaper, fielded their own candidates against them, and blasted Meitan as their lackey. Suddenly, they were eager to fill his shoes, Poseidis now believing, quote, that the base of the Communist parties behaved consciously, or almost, as an entrusted Trotskyist. That is, they acted within their own party to transform it and make it revolutionary. End quote. Leone arranged a meeting between the PCI and Poseidis shortly after his arrival. For days, his team prepared documents on the Italian situation, so he could prove himself their equal and win a lasting formal relationship. Quote, but nothing came of it, Leone wrote. Poseidis let it go. I seem to remember that with a classic projection mechanism. He said that the team was not prepared. But I am convinced that it was he who felt inadequate by comparison. End quote. He bragged that the cancelled meeting nevertheless proved their relevance, and told Leone to propose another meeting directly with the Soviets. Somehow, undisturbed by the previous cancellation, the PCI arranged an invitation to the Kremlin. Poseidus declined to attend himself, sending Alberto Sendik to Moscow in his place. His Soviet counterpart was Boris Ponomarev, the chief of the International Department of the Central Committee of the Soviet Union's Communist Party since 1955, effectively the leadership position of all non-Maoist communist parties worldwide. The meeting consisted of 3 questions for the Poseidists. What did they mean by worker state? Was it roughly equivalent to Marx's notion of the dictatorship of the proletariat? And why did they usually side with unions over Communist Party leadership when the two were in dispute? Sendik answered to the best of his ability, and the meeting ended in a comradely singing of the Internationale. Quote, Moscow talked with us recognizing our superior theoretical capacity, Poseidus boasted after reading a report from the meeting. Quote, they treated us as equal, but they didn't say, it's like this, but how do you interpret this? What does this say? How do you do this? They are discussing us above. End quote. He continued to view the meeting as positive, even after Ponomarev published a text criticizing Poseidism in the Old Fourth International titled, quote, Trotskyism, Instrument of Anti-Communism. The Poseidist tendency had, quote, defined the lines of the Chinese leaders as authentically revolutionary, it said, referring specifically to the question of preventative war, which was, to Ponomarev, a dangerous misreading of Lenin. Picture: the Partito Comunista Rivoluzionario Trotsista, Italian section of the Poseidist Fourth International, in 1973. End caption. Poseidus saw the text as evidence of Soviet regeneration nonetheless. He believed Ponomarev wrote it under pressure to suppress the growing popularity of Trotskyism within the Communist International of masses. As for the lines directly critical of him, he was pleased to be referred to as a, quote, leader of the Fourth International, and that the subsequent evisceration was accurate. Quote, 3 times he criticized me without slander. End quote. He instructed his sections to prepare by working closely with communist parties and building popular fronts. The Italian section began dutifully endorsing communist positions in their newspapers, and pasting posters supporting PCI candidates throughout Italy. Quote, Moscow is not going to call us immediately, he humbly admitted. Quote, they want to see what we do, what incentives we take, because they want to verify what we are, and also at the same time what is our reaction. It's possible there will be a test in order to measure our level of influence. End quote. After months in the Leone home, the connections the Poseidists earned through closer collaboration with the mass parties opened an exit from their poverty. Horrified by worsening repression in Latin America, European leftists were eager to support political refugees. Sympathizers appealed to wealthy family members for funds for the party, and Poseidus fostered a circle of modern painters, including Victor Vasarely, Wilfredo Lam, and Mario Schifano, to donate paintings. A single contribution from Schifano was, quote, worth the equivalent of several thousand euro, Dondero said, and he gave many. Eventually enough was raised for Poseidus to establish his own Coyoacan-style compound in the volcanic Alban Hills south of the city. They named it the Villa, meaning either a Roman mansion or a porteño shanty. Poseidus's old guard was flown in to live in a separate compound in Rome, nicknamed La Comuna. The crisis of H&M suddenly forgiven, Almeida was reinstated and brought to Italy. It was both an acknowledgement of his importance to the party and a punishment. His wife, Ana Teresa, was ordered to stay in Buenos Aires, so his libidinal energies would be focused solely on the party. Offered the same deal, Fanjul refused. Poseidus applied a similar discipline to himself. Although he badly missed his children, who feared they would be swept up in the next wave of anti-communist repression, they were told to stay in South America to lead the BLA in his stead. He knew the dangers were great, but the revolution was still coming. working-class revolt toppled the anti-communist Onganía government in Argentina. The now legalized Uruguayan POR had entered a powerful new leftist coalition called the Frente Amplio, and the banned parties in Mexico and Cuba slowly rebuilt their underground networks. The calmed uprisings of '68 only promised greater heights upon their return, and there was ample reason to believe that the '70s would be even more revolutionary. It was not the final collapse of capitalism he had once predicted for the end of the decade, but a pleasing final note nonetheless, like a gentle interlude before the cacophonous finale. This tense optimism was echoed in the infamous words of astronaut Neil Armstrong as he stepped onto the lunar dust in July of 1969. It was the most unifying event in the history of humanity, with millions simultaneously watching one man's small steps representing the collective labor of all mankind. The possibilities for what humanity could achieve, and how far it could go, as this unity coalesced and the masses came to power, were imagined to be limitless. Few could have believed that those lonely first steps from the lander would also be some of the last, civilization's peak still marked by a U.S. flag eternally caught in non-existent cosmic winds. End of section.